My client, Mr. Charles, is wanting to know as to what business structure would suit him best upon opening his barbershop. He is considering opening this business as a sole trader. However, he is also open to an idea of a company as well. I will be giving him information of the pros and cons of both business structures, but ultimately recommending starting a company as opposed to opening this business as a sole trader. From what I've gathered from the interview, Mr. Charles would like to keep his business as professional as possible. He is wanting to avoid the complexity of having to deal with individuals to whom he has close relationship with from entering or joining him in his business. By having the company structure, he will be able to deal with close friends and even close relations with very little to almost no favor at all, as he can always refer back to the business as owned by the company as opposed to the business being owned by him. He also wants to have an active role in this business and would like to keep his personal assets separate from the business. In the company structure, this will be made possible through the corporate shield, and it will also allow him to have dual roles. Unlike in sole trader, there will be no division between his personal assets and business assets. Therefore, if something goes wrong with the business, the creditors will be able to tap into his personal assets to pay for his business debts. Mr. Charles also intends to contract with other businesses. So, for example, hiring other barbers as sole traders instead of employing them as staff. And obviously, he will also be leasing a commercial property to conduct his business. Now, as a sole trader, he will also be able to contract with other businesses, but being in a company structure, Mr. Charles will not be personally liable as a member of a company because contract dealings will be done through the company. I will also explain to him that if he goes through the company structure, the law allows him to be both its governing director as well as its company secretary. And obviously mention that fiduciary duties of a company director, and that as long as he acts within the guidelines and adhere to the legal duties expected from a company director, he will not be held liable. He has also plans of expanding the business in the future, and as well as employing staff. Again, adapting the company structure will make things easier for him, as the company can manage and run different businesses. Regulations will be set in place in the company's constitution as to how these businesses should be managed and by who. This is given he nominates someone else to personally manage the other business. And by him being the company director, he will still play an active role in these businesses. I believe the company structure is his best avenue to accomplish that purpose. I will also be explaining to him the assets acquired by the company, including profits, is owned by the company, so he will need to open a separate company bank account. Speaking of assets as well, a question was raised by Mr. Charles as to what would happen to the assets of the company if he decides to end the company. I will be advising him that as a sole director, he will not be able to simply keep the assets or profits and properties as his own. All these properties and assets will be sold, and the profits shall be divided accordingly, providing that the company does not own any money or debts to any creditors. I will also be explaining to him that a company will be governed by a constitution. It may either be the replaceable rules under the Corporations Act 2001, or the company can make its own constitution tailored around what would suit best for the company. I will also be covering some of the questions Mr. Charles has asked. Example, he was wanting to know if he decides to go with the company structure and nominate himself as a sole trader, how will he get paid? I will be advising him that as a sole director and a sole shareholder, he will have to write and sign his own resolution, including determining his own wage. He asked about personal insurances and insurances that he will need to get for the business. I shall inform him that as a sole trader, he won't be covered by the workers' compensation insurance. Therefore, he needs to get his own personal insurance. But as a company director, he will not be needing the cover because usually work cover claims are done through the company. But as for the business insurance, I will refer him to the Australian Business License and Information Services website. Every single permit, license, or insurance that he will need for the business will be available for him to search on the website. He has also mentioned about registration of business trademark. If registration of business name automatically register his business trademark as well. I will be advising him that the answer to that question is no, because registration of business name is done through ASIC, while business trademark registration is usually done in Intellectual Property Australia. So I will refer him to the IP Australia website. I shall also discuss briefly the steps of registering the business name and the company name through ASIC, and that he has to make sure that the names he intends to use for both business name and company name are still available for him to use. He also mentioned about fees for both registration of business and company. Again, I will refer him to the ASIC website for all the current fees, as well as the IP Australia website. He also raised a question about doing business as a sole trader. What happens to the business once Mr. Charles decides that he no longer wants to trade? As a sole trader, I will be advising him that if he goes into this business as a sole trader, providing that all the accounts and debts are settled before he actually closed the door of his business, it will be solely up to him to, he could either sell the business or keep the properties and assets. It is true that all these things can be accomplished through either business structure, but ultimately, if he wants no liabilities as to any of the activities that his or debts that his business can incur in the future, if he wants to be able to take advantage of the corporate shield, then he should and he must start this business as a company. Cost-wise, if Mr. Charles does decide to expand the business, obviously having the company structure will benefit him more than having two separate businesses in the long run.